This hour...
Forgive me. Forgive me. Forgive me.
Boris Johnson once described his relationship with God as a bit like trying to get a radio signal while driving through the Chilterns, although it seems now he has fully tuned in to the messages from the Church of England, and the former Prime Minister doesn't like what he hears. In an argument that only really seems to make sense if you've been at the wine, Boris Johnson has blamed the Church of England for Britain's obesity crisis, saying that its failure to provide people with the spiritual sustenance they need was leading people to gorge themselves. The former Prime Minister said that when he was younger, it was very rare, I'm quoting him, very rare for there to be a fatso in the class. Now they're all fatsos, and I'd be shot for saying they're fatsos, but it's the truth, end quote. He criticised Justin Welby and other religious leaders for going on about slavery reparations rather than addressing people's spiritual needs. He said this failing was leading to a decline in church attendance. He says the living bread is being provided by Tesco's, and they're gorging themselves on the real living bread. Of the Archbishop of Canterbury, he said he and religious leaders should try to fill what is obviously an aching spiritual void in people's lives that drives them to gorge themselves. Religious leaders, as well as politicians, they think, what is up with people that they are plainly seeking solace in something that they know is self-destructive? And when did you last hear the Archbishop of Canterbury preaching a sermon about that? You know, there he is, droning on about how we're all guilty and we must all be more left-wing, end quote. He recounted a recent visit to church with his family. He says, I went to church yesterday. I was one of about 10 people. Well, I mean, 15 if you added up my family. It was all about how rich men can't go through the eye of the needle and all that sort of pot. Why aren't people going to church? Because it's not really addressing the things, people's spiritual needs. There's something going on with people. They're needing a lack of something. They're eating it. They're not getting it. Johnson said that higher levels of obesity among children was also the result of people being told that there were, and I'm quoting again, paedophiles everywhere. He said, when I was a kid, we were all out playing in the streets the whole time. You don't see that with kids nowadays. Now they're all fatsos. I'll be shot for saying they're fatsos, but that's the truth. You talk about living bread of spiritual sustenance. Well, it's not being provided by the blooming church. The living bread is being provided by Tesco, and they're gorging themselves on the real living bread. That's what they're doing. So a couple of questions for you. Can you work out what he's on about? Question one. Question two. Does closest to God mean distance from bad food? Question three. Is he right that children aren't as active as they once were because their parents are far more worried about crime or about what could happen to them if they went off down the street to play with their mates all day without coming home until tea time? Question four. What's he on about? Christopher Snowden is head of lifestyle economics at the IEA. Let's start with questions 1 and 4. What's he on about?
I think I know what he's on about. I've read this transcript, and I was like you this morning when I saw some of these quotes. I assumed maybe there had been drink taken before this interview, and perhaps there had been. And he does ramble on in a Johnsonian manner, but his basic points, bear in mind he's being asked about obesity and what the government should do about it. He is saying, firstly, that there are fat kids because they're not getting enough exercise, and secondly, that a lot of adults overeat because they are essentially sad. And that they wouldn't be if they found the spiritual fulfillment he thinks people should get from the church. He goes on a lot, and he goes on a digression about the failings of the Church of England, which are not really relevant. But I think that is more or less what he's trying to say.
I guess one could easily suggest that there are also religious people who are perhaps slightly overweight. Are they sad because they're closer to God, or are they just sad anyway?
Well, I don't know if he's claiming to have, the complete answer here, and I'm not even sure whether he's necessarily right.
I'm not sure he's heard the question.
But I think it's not quite as incoherent as it maybe initially sounds. I think he is trying to make a point to two people who are very keen on heavy government intervention as the answer to obesity, that actually there are kind of other reasons, socioeconomic and psychological reasons for the rise in obesity.
Let's start on point 1. How true is it to say that there are more fat children because more children are not getting enough exercise?
Well, it's not 100% clear there actually are more fat children. The way we measure obesity makes it very difficult to tell, and we haven't been doing it all that long, actually. The measure for child obesity only came in the 1990s. But I think it is certainly true to say that amongst both children and adults, there has been a decline in physical activity. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. It's hard to put a finger on it. Public Health England used to say it's been about a 25% decline in calories burnt off since the 1960s.
How the hell would they know?
Well, it's difficult, but there have been studies looking at this. You can, broadly speaking, make an estimate at how many calories people are burning off. There's something called doubly labeled water, which helps, but I won't get into that. But there is a big reduction in both workplace physical activity and leisure time physical activity because of things like the motor car and various labor-saving devices. So yeah, undoubtedly people are not burning off the calories they used to, and I think he's right if he is saying that is the major reason there's been a rise in obesity.
And this suggestion that part of the reason children aren't getting enough exercise is because they're not going out, as children of his generation perhaps did more. And the suggestion is because parents are worried about criminality. Now, criminality without fraud overall in England is down over the course of the last 20 or so years, but violent crime is up a bit. So are people right to be a bit more worried about violent crime?
No, not really, but people's perception of crime rarely tallies with what the actual crime figures are. And I think people are more nervous about all sorts of things these days. And generally speaking, parents are much more protective than they used to be. So I think that probably is one reason why kids are not getting out and playing. You hear people saying all the time that in their day they would go off during the summer holidays in the morning and they wouldn't come back till dark, and that was all there was to it. And it's probably true that not many kids are allowed to do that anymore. So again, he sounds like a man in a pub, but I think has a point.
The big difference between then and now, i.e. when he was growing up and when I was growing up, and certainly when my children are growing up, is the availability and actually relative price-friendly availability of different types of ultra-processed food. They're everywhere. All the data that measures this says the opportunities to eat have gone from about 4 throughout the day in the 1950s to 267 or whatever it might be nowadays. That's a huge problem.
Yeah, that's probably true. And he does mention himself that he used to be drinking endless bottles of Tizer and so on. It's not as if you couldn't get your hands on a Mars bar back in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, you're right that we have more vending machines and things like that around. So if kids have got money in their pocket, they are perhaps more able to spend it on snacks.
And do you think that's an area where the state should intervene, Christopher?
Well, I don't see really how it can. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to tax chocolate bars so much that kids can't afford them? I mean, I don't see any politically feasible way of clamping down on children spending pocket money on sweets.
So what do we think is the best way then? Or what would you promote?
I'm not sure there is one. I'm not sure there is one. And
Wegovy.
Yeah, well, that definitely works, but it's very expensive. So whether it's actually cost effective for the NHS to prescribe it, I think is a bit of a moot point. But in the long term, for a lot of people, that will be the solution when it comes off patent in the 2030s.
Very good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on. Christopher Snowden, Head of Lifestyle Economics at the IEA, who's done a bit of translating of what it was he thinks Boris Johnson was saying as part of it, actually, funnily enough, a review into obesity. So pick up on those 2 points. What Boris Johnson is saying is people overeat because they're sad. And whether that sadness is as a result of they lack a spiritual connection with a higher power, or because they've got no money at the end of the month, or because they live in a hellhole, whatever that sadness is driven by, one of the effects of that sadness is overeating. I think that's true. There are, when you're putting the latest bit of ultra-processed food into you, that you're in a bad way if you've been doing it year after year after year and you're, 30 stone? 35 stone? I mean, how big do you want to get? It's bad, but you're doing it because it's habitual, and part of the habit of it is formed by how you feel about yourself, and that may ultimately be a view of sadness, depression. The other point is about the not getting enough exercise because the world is a more dangerous place. on those 2 points, not that he put it as succinctly as that, frankly, but on those 2 points, is there some truth to it? Forget God for a bit. I mean, you might want to talk about God, but forget God. It's not about God. There is a sadness at the heart of Britain that is leading to more obese people, and there is less opportunity for your child to go outside and play because you're much more worried about the environment that you live in, that they live in, and that they're going to come to some harm. Gavin's in Crawley. Gavin.
Yes, hi. So what I can see is that Boris Johnson is basically... The church has gone away from what it used to do, which was for the benefit of people, their health and happiness in society. So they had the 7 deadly sins, which included adultery and, of course, gluttony. And gluttony is eating far too much. Now, those are things that are relevant to most of society. And also there was practices like fasting over Lent, which is also very good for your health and well-being. Now, if you go on to esoteric and mostly irrelevant types of things to most of society, where you're preaching to a very, very small audience. Now, you need to go back to the 7 deadly sins, and remember, just like Charles Dickens, as we're coming up to Christmas with the Christmas Carol, there was the ghost of Christmas past, didn't make much difference, ghost of Christmas present, but it was the ghost of Christmas future that caused Scrooge to change. And all human beings are fearful of the future, and if you're going to go to hell and have purgatory and lots of torture for the rest of your life, you're likely to influence and change your behavior. So they should be going back to what worked before instead of some intellectual university-type calculation as to what clever arguments you can come up with for society. That's my opinion.
Huh. Have you been at the wine, Gavin?
Nope.
Oh, right. So we go back to the 7 deadly sins because they tell us a story about ourselves that is far neater, easier than the stories we're telling ourselves now?
Well, basically, all religions are designed to make a better and more harmonious society, right? You're living into a future, and it's not helpful if, some guy's going off with another one's wife, or stealing, thievery, or if people are eating too much and they're getting unable to do anything, and it's not even good for their own health and well-being. So all of these manuals from religions were all designed to help society, whether they were going to be attacked, whether they had a surplus of food, whether they had a lack of food, or peace and stability, all of that. They were the best manual that some guy could come up with the help of others, and they've just gone off course, and they've just gone intellectually...
But But the question I've written down after listening to you, Gavin, and I'm sorry that I've written this down, and it's the only thing that came into my head, and I apologise in advance, but have you ever seen a fat vicar?
I've seen some fat bishops.
Thank you very much.